called the Dead Sea Plain. The sites are Babedra,
Yeah. Now we're
Imnak,
starting.
Feifa, and Numeira.
Okay.
Babedra is the best well-known of these sites, and it has been extensively excavated by serious archaeologists who became interested when in the 1960s, massive quantities of pottery from the site appeared on the antiquities market in Jerusalem. Paul Lapp and his students Tom Schaub and Walt Rast set out to excavate what turned out to be a series of ancient cemeteries and a fortified town on the Lisan Peninsula near the southeastern end of the Dead Sea. Two cemeteries, which they cited as EB1A and EB1B, were partially excavated, yielding rich finds. The tombs in them had very specific types of pottery in the early EB1A cemetery, which they were able to identify as earlier because of some of those tombs lay physically beneath tombs that were full of pottery and other artifacts, definitely identified as later EB1, or what is also known as EB1B. EB1A tombs were replete with pottery that is site specific. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. And I can see you also very well.
Oh, okay. Okay. In other words, specific types of shapes and decorations from the early Babedra tombs are found at no other site. The type of decoration is called punctate, and many of the pots have special shapes that are not found elsewhere. Punctate means tiny holes in lines forming patterns in the outer layers of pots, kind of like pinpricks. Shaft tombs, in other words, tombs entered by vertical shafts found there, were reused from time to time with several chambers dug into the soil. Those burials represent an unknown span of time, but are all earlier than the late EB1 burials. So we have the EB1A cemetery, or actually they're in different places, but it's sometimes called cemeteries. But they're earlier tombs and they have very specific kinds of artifacts. Although the excavators claim those tombs were made by nomads who periodically came to bury their dead at this one place, there are two main reasons not to accept that hypothesis. Nowhere in the world do nomads make pottery. Just is not convenient for them. Nor is there any instance of nomads burying their dead in very elaborate tombs, such as the tombs at Babedra. Pottery from these tombs, found in massive quantities, is fragile and cumbersome and is not fitting for people periodically moving over significant distances, as are nomads or semi-nomads. In one early EB1 cemetery, there is also evidence of mud brick architecture, which argues against nomadic occupation. Nomads do not use mud bricks to build their houses. When they have to pick up and leave, they just take their tents and go. Further, I believe it is more likely that more early EB1 deposits lie beneath the adjacent EB2 town. There must have been a settlement for people who interred their dead in these tombs. There's so many of them. Perhaps deep probes under the town will uncover evidence of it. More telling is that despite much surveying over the major region, there is no evidence of sites where large numbers of nomads resided. Such sites would be easily identified by the special pottery and other cumbersome objects, such as stone bowls of the types found in these tombs. That kind of material would be found in the debris of abandoned settlements, and we don't have any such information. I note also that there are cemeteries with tombs of the late EB1, EB2, and EB3 periods. And even at Baba Dra, there are tombs of the EB4 period, which is a period that is after all the towns disappeared, which means that people were active at the site for hundreds of years at Baba Dra and probably in Anak and also Feifa. In addition to Baba Dra, there are two very large cemeteries farther south at Enak, which is in the Rora Safi, and Feifa. They contained the remains of thousands of people who were interred there over several centuries. These cemeteries are rather mysterious because we have no solid information as to where the people who buried their dead lived. Those cemeteries were in use from about 3,200 BCE to about 2,800 BCE. The Enak cemetery was in use in EB1 and was probably used as late as early EB2, or from about 3,300 BCE to about 2,800 BCE. It is an immense cemetery. It covered at least 20 hectares, making it one of the largest early Bronze Age cemeteries in the Levant. Unfortunately, it has been mostly looted, with some excavations done by archaeologists, Mohammed Wahib, Mohammed Najal, and by Konstantinos Politis. Thousands of graves were dug into the soil on hillsides above the Wadi Delta at Enak. The graves are small trenches or kists, some lined with very colorful, smooth wadi cobbles found on the site, while others were merely dug into the earth. There are even two very large rectangular tombs fashioned of massive slabs of flat stones that are entered by a few steps, which lead into chambers that one can stand up in. They look as if they're almost houses made for the dead. Whether these tombs were of special people, elites, or for many burials of just a lot of people is uncertain. From looting of the site and some legal excavations, we know of tens of thousands of ceramic pots, including one special type of cup in the Anak cemetery. It has been found almost exclusively there. These teacup-like pots have small knobs on their thin handles and are called Safi cups by archaeologists. That's a name I gave to it after hearing it about it from people working in Jordan. Tombs also yielded special bracelets of lambish shells. They're kind of seashells, which when they're cut, make large white bracelets. Also found in the tombs are very large basalt bowls. These last are typical of the EB1 period, and they require an awful lot of work to make them out of big chunks of basalt, which is a very hard stone. Suffice it to know that there are also in this cemetery at Enak tombs of the Byzantine period with inscribed tombstones of Christians in Greek and Jews in Aramaic, but they're not the subject of today's talk. Clearly, these EB tombs at Anak are not of nomads, nor are many more tombs found at the site of Feifa. The mystery is where the people who are buried in these cemeteries lived. So far, no one has turned up evidence of habitations of this period at either site. At Anak, there is a much later settlement of the Islamic period buried beneath the delta of the Wadi. I suspect the Ibi settlement could be buried even lower down, possibly beneath the Islamic settlement. Another mysterious aspect is the massive amounts of pottery derived from all these early Bronze Age tombs. The pottery from the early tombs at Baba Dra is very skillfully fashioned and well fired. Clearly, the potters knew how to make very pleasing shapes that were symmetrical and nicely finished. They had also great control over the firing and produced good hardwares, durable but fragile as is all pottery. Where did the potters who made them live and work? Who were these potters that had such skill? The origins of the Babedra pots from the early cemetery and the Safi cups produced in great quantities, as well as the finely fashioned basalt bowls, remain a mystery. Hopefully, more exploration in Jordan will uncover information on these aspects of ancient activity. The major loss from the Anak cemetery is in the bones that were not preserved. Now, with modern DNA studies, we could have had lots of really important information on the population. What were the origins of these people? Did they have connection to locals from earlier periods, or were they somehow people that came from a different place and settled there? And were they related to later Middle Bronze Age populations? Those kinds of questions cannot be answered. Truthfully, we know very little about the early Bronze people in the southern Levant. At Numeira, there is another early Bronze Age town of the early Bronze III period. It was explored by Tom Schaub and Walt Rast and has been published very well by Meredith Chesson. The region also appears to have been had some nomadic, semi-nomadic people living on the fringe of the towns. If you look around in the area of Anak and Lot's tomb, or Lot's whatever it is, there's a church there that commemorating Saint Lot. There is evidence of different types of cemeteries, which are table-like structures, two uprights and one flat table, used for burial. Those and tumuli, or cairns, which are heaps of stones covering burials, are found also in rather large quantities in the landscape. And it's likely that they are burials of nomads or semi-nomads who were also living in the region. What does this tell us about the region in the early Bronze Age? Probably the climate was less harsh than it is now, much cooler, and that there was sufficient rainfall that filled the wadis at least seasonally. That, of course, would happen up on the highlands to the east. This low-lying plain is hundreds of meters below sea level. And despite it being so harsh and dry and hot these days, in the fourth millennium and in the third millennium, it was home to some very large communities during what we call the early Bronze Age. Besides the early Bronze II town of Baba Dra, there was another later town, and all these towns and places can be visited. There's something to see at them. We also know that from about 3,300 BCE through about 2,500 BCE, people were living and dying and burying their dead in the region. Some of these people were living in towns and in what we call stationary architecture, and others were moving across the landscape, living where they could, the way Bedouins do today. It was fruitful enough, this region, to support sedentarists. Those are people who live in place, living in towns, and those people built their houses of stone and mud brick. The Bedouin-like people, semi-nomads or nomads, were living in the region, and they probably lived in tents made of either animal skins, or possibly they were weaving cloth and they were living in tents like that. They also tended to leave evidence in that they would put single lines of stones around the edge of these tents to keep them in place. So when you see those kinds of remains in the landscape, you suspect that they belong to not sedentarists, but semi-nomadic or nomadic peoples. In the late EB1 period, we know that the people living in this plain near the Dead Sea were engaged with trade with people living on the hilly country and regions to the west of the Jordan River. As much of the pottery in the later EB1 and EB2 tombs found there is similar to that found in the region of Jerusalem, the Judean mountains, and as far as the Mediterranean coastal plain. Studies of the actual material from which the pottery was made, the clay, shows much of it came from near Jerusalem in deposits known as the Moza Formation, which is a geological formation found in the region of Jerusalem. Thus, the people living in the towns of the Dead Sea Plain were actually part of the greater early Bronze Age culture of the southern Levant. Specifically, they had connections with the southern region because in the north, the pottery and other types of artifacts are somewhat different. So these people were somehow part of the greater early Bronze Age culture that prevailed in the Levant in the southern region, more or less at the end of the fourth millennium and for at least the first half of the third millennium BCE. The end of the early Bronze Age experience came late in the third millennium. What caused it is uncertain, but it was something that was experienced also in much more fertile regions, specifically to the west of the Jordan River and also in the mountains of Jordan to the east. By late in the third millennium, the towns of Numera and Babadra region were abandoned. We don't know why. There may be causes of, well, we don't really know. We don't, possibly there was a major drought or whatever. But anyway, the entire system of towns all over the southern Levant collapsed. It happened probably slowly. We don't have too much information. Third millennium, people were living in much smaller communities. They were not, for the most part, not fortified, and they were living at a much lower level with less fancy pottery and fewer artifacts. In early Bronze Age, people, we call that the early Bronze Age 4, and that ended sometime around the beginning of the second millennium. They also had different burial customs. There are some graves of the early Bronze Age period at Babadra, the early Bronze Age 4 period, and in some other regions. The pottery continues to be made, but it's on a much smaller scale, and the types are quite different, although they still have things that features that remind you of the early Bronze Age 1 and 2 pots. Afterwards, in the Middle Bronze Age, new people come with new ideas of how to make pots, and they also start building and living in much larger settlements, which become towns in the full Middle Bronze Age period. One town that somehow seems to have maintained its life during the early Bronze Age 4 is the site of Khirbet Iskander, which is a bit farther north and a bit farther to the east, that in Jordan. But that's another chapter in the history of this region. I would also like to suggest that anybody visiting Jordan goes and sees the museum at Rore Safi. I think it's a beautiful, fairly new museum with some very fascinating material. I've been once or twice, and I think it's great fun to see the kind of things that came out of the tombs and that have been so well preserved and beautifully shown in the museum.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back.
How's that?
I'm back in my visual form, and I wanted to ask you a
Do
couple
you
of
have any
questions.
questions?
Yes,
Okay.
how economically the region around Warsaw was connected to the western side, to Negev and areas around Tel Arad.
Well, if we look at the pottery, mostly the pottery that comes from the tombs, and actually the best preserved pottery, EB1B and EB2 tombs, it's obviously not made specifically for that site. Lots of the material comes from the West. Petrographically, we know that there's certain types of pots that are made in the West from this Moza formation. Exactly where they're making, we don't know. You find the same kind of pottery in Jericho. You find the same kind of pottery in the site of, well, in what's called Etel or Ha'ai, which is not far from Jerusalem. It's closer to Ramallah. And you find it a little bit in tombs all over the Judean hills. So, and in Jerusalem. So we know that there was trade. Again, we're not talking about a time when you had different polities and borders. People came and went and sold and traded and bartered all over the region. There were no, not that we know of, there were no specific rules on how it works. But if we look at the pottery, we can see that it was moving mostly from the West. We don't know where they were making this pottery. We just know where the sources of the clay came from. If you're interested in knowing about the pottery of the early Bronze Age, the most important site has to be found in a much earlier period, which is at the end of the Chalcolithic or the beginning of the early Bronze Age one period, which dates to about 3,900 to 3,700 BCE, and that is in the Jordan Valley at this fantastic site called Tel Abu Habil or Tal Abu Habil. There they have an actual factory which over several generations people were making pottery and firing it with very sophisticated methods. And it's not well published, but some preliminary reports show it to be probably the most interesting site and certainly the earliest evidence of actual pottery production sites in the southern Levant. There are similar sites known from Syria and Mesopotamia, but this is the very earliest found in the southern Levant. I'm hoping someday there'll be a major publication of that material because it's absolutely fascinating. It's actually a factory where there are scores of these pottery kilns of two different types, very sophisticated technology. And we hope to see some kind of final publication which will explain it better. There are a few sites west of the Jordan where we have evidence of pottery production, actually sites where they made it. One is in the site of another site near modern here. But that's it. We have many millions of potsherds from the Chalcolithic, the Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, and the early Bronze Age period, but only a few sites where pottery production was actually happening in the southern Levant. So,
What do you think, Elliot, about the problem of looting in the area of Gor Safi? Because we said that there are many individual and collective graves on that cemetery, but it was ravished by looting, which goes back probably for longer than a century.
well, uh, it's terrible shame because so much information has been lost.
Yeah.
When we have pots that come and we don't know exactly where they come from, then people sometimes will buy them, but they don't give us any real information. We don't have. Apparently, there were thousands of graves looted. Uh, Somebody did a survey, and I think using aerial photography, and said 20 hectares, which is an immense area, full of these tombs that were looted. It's probably it's a function of people not having money, and when they don't have money, they look for something to sell, and it's like a mine. You can go and dig there and pull out pots, and if they're not broken, you can find somebody who will pay money for it. That's a problem of museums and collectors and so on. I've seen pottery from Safi that was confiscated from people in at the Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. There were pots from all different periods. If you go into Jerusalem to the antiquities dealers, I have pictures of pots from cemeteries all over, very much from the early Bronze Age in the area of Nablus, in the area of Tel Farah North, and other places. So I think it's a matter when people don't have enough money, they look for something that they can get supposedly for free, and that archaeology loses by it. It happens all over the world. There's a major uh, there's a major market for antiquities of every type and every period, from the Far East to the American Indians and so on, South America. And it's kind of a shame because that's information that we would like to have so that we know more about the people who came before us. That's something, uh, I find it difficult to deal with.
If you want to add something, please go ahead. We have last 8 minutes and 25 seconds, like in basketball.
Well, I'm hoping that the more we nowadays, the way people are excavating is much better than when I was active in the field, because we have more scientific help with all kinds of specialty things, checking out, looking for metal and checking out what we can do with the metal and analyzing it, DNA studies and everything else. So the future of archaeology will teach us so much more about the people in the past and how they managed to deal with problems. Where did they get their food good was the culture actively?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
You're kind of frozen on the screen.
No, I had the same impression about you.
Okay.
It
Anyway,
seems
that
it's
that's about it.
neutral freezing.
I see.
Now we're back.
Well,
Thank you for
okay.
your time.
I'm
Yes, please go ahead.
My pleasure. I'm off to France, hopefully on Sunday, if they don't cancel my flight. And we can be in touch by internet, but it'll be this. I have here much faster internet. In France, it'll be something much slower. So maybe we can do something or not.
Me-
Anyway, in the first week in June, I hope to be in Lyon for the meeting, and I'll give a short lecture there. So
Hopefully they're going to
take
upload.
care, be
I
well,
will.
and
Thank you.
okay,
All the best.
good to be in touch.
Thank you so much.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.